So we need to deal with Greek theater. Now, in terms of theater, we usually connect the ideas of theater to the Greeks, but of course, it's not the Greeks that really invent it. They are, however, the ones that come up with the modern conception of theater as we know it today. And the Greeks are very conventional in that their productions will follow a standard model of expectations and rules. After all, as human beings, we love predictability. And they did not rely on effects and illusion. Instead, what they did is they relied on the audience's imagination. So effects wouldn't hamper the playwright. The audience simply accepts these poetic descriptions. Now, to give you an idea of this, imagine the last time you read a really good book, or maybe a series of books. Maybe you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, or you're a fan of The Hobbit, or Harry Potter, any of those. And you read the book, and you've got this image in your mind. It's probably this absolutely brilliant image that only your mind could really come up with. And then you go and see the Peter Jackson version, and it's not the same. Or you go and see Harry Potter the movie, and it's just not the same. And it never will be, because suddenly they're trying to come up with an image that, based on the limitations of the physical world, can't possibly match that which is in your mind. So the Greeks are aware of this, and they focus on the audience using their imagination. This is sort of, well, really, Greek theater starts as effectively storytelling, and then they'll slowly add things to it. But it really does rely on that sense of imagination. Now, we know very little about their productions. We know that theater was part of 3 religious festivals per year. One for comedy, and another was specifically for tragedy. The third kind of mixed the two forms, the two genres. And what they'll do is they will present 4 plays at each of these festivals by each author. Each author must present 3 tragedies and a burlesque comedy. The idea of the comedy is to keep people from getting into this very sort of negative mindset that you would have if you were surrounded by tragedy all day. Obviously, in the case of the Festival for Comedy, this isn't such an issue. And burlesque comedy here means a comedy dealing with very low hanging fruit, as it were, dealing with bodily function, sexuality, etc. And we only see 3 authors chosen for each festival, so there's a lot of competition amongst the playwrights. Often, you will have 1 actor plus the chorus, and the playwright will often play the lead role. Now, we're going to deal with a couple of these playwrights, and the biggest problem we will run into is a filter. So, when we look at history, anything from ancient Greece has to pass through a couple of different societies before it gets to us. So Greek theater passes through the Romans. The Romans like it. They pass it on. It goes to the Byzantine. They like most of it. Some disappears, and they pass it on. It ends up in the Islamic world. Now, in Islam, they don't like the plays very much. They just aren't into theater. So very little will pass from Islam back into Europe. So we have this series of filters that it goes through before it gets to us. Consequently, we don't know a lot about these playwrights. One we do know about, however, is Sophocles. He, of course, is famous for writing Oedipus, Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King. And he experienced the shame of the Athenian defeat by the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. So what he's doing is he's focusing on this increased realism and these subtle characters, looking at themes of responsibility, dignity, and fate. Now, these are themes that we tend to see when we see a general downturn. The idea of personal responsibility, the idea of personal dignity. Even if you're poor or in bad situation, you must have dignity. And the idea that sometimes it's just fate. And this is a rough time. Sophocles is writing during a very rough time in Greek history. It's a big downturn for them. A lot of people are saying this is the end of Greek society. Of course, it won't be. We know the Hellenistic is going to come up, but that's where he's writing. So he's got these very complex thoughts and consequently very complex plots that he adds to his plays. Then we've got Euripides. Now, Euripides focuses on individual emotion rather than large events. He's not worried about the audience or the population as a whole. He's looking at specific individuals. Euripides is much more modern that way, in that he's trying to get us to understand a specific character. And he's much less poetic. He writes in the vernacular or everyday Greek language, which means he's dealing with everyday themes. He also changed theater by experimenting with painted backdrops. He's the first to really use backdrops and settings. Now, he becomes very, very unpopular. In fact, he was not popular at all during his time. We only remember him because his plays survived. They got through those filters I talked about earlier. Why isn't he popular? Well, he questioned Greek religious practice. We don't like it when people question our religious practice, especially, well, quite literally on the main stage. He also focuses on popular dissatisfaction with contemporary events. He's writing at roughly the same time as Sophocles, and people are generally unhappy. Things are not going well, so he's reflecting that. And people don't necessarily want a mirror held up to them in their bad times. We like that in good times, but we don't like it in bad times. So he's not popular at the time, although he's popular now primarily because his plays happen to survive. Then we have theater design. How do they design a theater overall? And what we see is we have this very basic design. In the center, we have an orchestra. And the orchestra is where most of the play will take place. You would think it would be back here on what appears to be a stage, but most Greek plays take place down here in the pit, in the orchestra. Then we have the theatron, which is the seating around the stage. And this is built into a hill, so the acoustics are actually exceptionally good. You could hear a single human voice being projected through the entire crowd. In the back, we have the skene. And this is basically where Euripides will hang his stage setting. But for the most part, this is storage. So don't read this as a stage. Later, this will be used as a stage, but for most of Greek history, for most of classical Greek theater, this is all just a building for storage, for backdrops, for dressing rooms, etc. At some point, that stage will begin to develop, probably later when we get towards the Hellenistic. The form of the theater is developed for its acoustic qualities. And in terms of seating, the wealthy would sit at the front. Actually, if you're particularly wealthy, you might actually get a seat right at the edge of the orchestra. And this is fine because there's really not any action going on here. This is mostly the actor singing or saying his part, and then we'll have a chorus off to the side singing their parts. So a lot of times people, when they go to Greek theater, would have closed their eyes and simply listened to the story like someone was reading it to you, imagining exactly what's going on. Now, the Romans will repeat this form, and this becomes really the basic foundation of Western theater.